Hello everybody and welcome to another video. Today I wanted to do a bit of a discussion piece on the future of Guild Wars 2 in terms of how ArenaNet are dealing with new content. I wanted to do this video because I think a lot of people might not be aware of these crazy ideas they've got, and B, I wanted to discuss whether they're actually any good or not, because they are very experimental and I'm kind of on the fence myself. I think this could be a really good thing or a really bad thing. So for those of you who don't know, the skinny basically is that ArenaNet, originally they announced that they were going to be doing like living story stuff or frequent live updates alongside working on expansion. That was the original words, but that kind of got thrown out the window, it seems like, a long time ago. Now, a couple of months back, NCSoft announced that they were interested in doing an expansion for Guild Wars 2, but more recently, like within the latest month, there's been tons of interviews and articles and stuff that have come out from the devs, particularly from the lead content designer at ArenaNet itself, who are essentially saying that they have no expansion under the works right now, and they have no plans really to do one at all. Not this year, and not necessarily next year either. Now, they do say that they're not 100% against the idea of an expansion, but they kind of see it as sort of redundant right now, and that they don't need to do one because they can release all of their new content in a much more frequent way that also happens to be free to us. So I think it's today. It could be starting from today. It might have been smart for me to have waited until this new map and stuff comes out today. But basically, ArenaNet are making the living story content, which, as you all know, started rolling out around January at a glacial pace. The living story stuff is now going bi-weekly, and that's huge. That's like pretty amazing, honestly. Every 2 weeks, if you are exclusively a PvE player, you're going to have new content, new titles, new places to explore, new things to achieve every 2 weeks. And from the sounds of it, a lot of substantial stuff every 2 weeks. That's like a night and day difference from our first experience of the living story, which was Flame and Frost, that basically took 4 months to release. You know, a pretty hefty chapter of the living story, all told, but it took 4 months to release, like, what is essentially not that much content. Now we've got every 2 weeks, we're going to have, like, loads of new stuff going into the game. ArenaNet did always promise us that the living story was going to ramp up, that they were just sort of learning how to get used to it. They were just organising their teams. They've got 4 teams of people who are working on the living story now, and that slowly it would ramp up, and they've held very true to that. I think a lot of people are a bit soured by the living story right now because of those original experiences where, you know, we were originally seeing the camps arriving in the Black Citadel and in Holbrack, and you had people walking around with a magnifying glass every single day hoping for a small change here or there. And I think those people that were looking for those things and didn't find that might have felt like the living story is not as good as ArenaNet wanted it to be. But things have changed a lot. Every 2 weeks, like a big bulk upload, now that we understand how they're doing, now that ArenaNet understands how they're doing it, that could mean a lot of very good stuff. Essentially, ArenaNet's idea is, because of this living story strategy that they call it, they can release an expansion's equivalent amount of content for free to us and keep the majority of the player base in the game without flocking to it and leaving. Now, it sort of makes a lot of sense for ArenaNet to be doing this from a business standpoint, and I can really understand why they're going this route. It's because it sounds like the majority of their money, by a long way, comes from their microtransactions rather than boxed sales. They've stated many times that, like, in terms of money, they're in a very cushiony place. There's no worries there at all, and the idea of having to sell boxed expansions to survive as a company, like they did with the first game, is sort of a non-idea at this point. And in fact, if they can just have a player base that isn't very volatile, that just does stay around for a long time, then the money that they're getting from microtransactions is only going to go up. And because Guild Wars 2 doesn't have a subscription fee, people are more willing and more happy to just put the game down, right? And that sounds kind of bizarre, because you'd think if you're paying for the game, if it was a subscription costing MMO and you're paying for it, you'd be more likely to leave because, hey, it's costing you money. But it's kind of the reverse. If people are paying, then they feel obligated to stay. But with Guild Wars 2, they've kind of already bought it, and then they'll just pick it up and leave and come back at any old time, right? So just because of that, ArenaNet have got a more volatile consumer based, and if they adopted the traditional expansion system, then they would just encourage this idea of people flocking to it, playing for maybe 1 or 2 months, blasting through all of the content, and then leaving, and then the game goes to a really low player base for like the next 2 years while they develop the next expansion. And that's not ideal because they're getting more money from the microtransactions. So this new idea is that every other week, a player of Guild Wars 2, whether they're active in the game or not, can think to themselves, I wonder what's going on in Tyria right now. Should I tune in for this week's episode? And they're kind of doing it like that. It's meant to be mimicking TV in a small way. And by doing that, they're getting a lot more in the way of microtransactions. And I guess in a way, I can see that that's smart and that could be a very good idea. I can also see that with this model, the ArenaNet potentially, okay, now there's no assurance for this, but potentially, ArenaNet could be giving us, players of a subscription-free fee MMO, I hate saying that, a subscription fee free MMO, more content than an expansion could be worth, that comes out more frequently and is completely free to us as well. And that could be another big positive, but there is no assurance that we're going to be getting that much content, or that it's going to be of the same quality than an expansion could offer us. And I think that's a really big deal. That lack of an assurance, I think, hurts the community as a whole in quite a big way. See, for me, I think one of the most important things about going with the expansion route is the marketing that can go behind it and the excitement that vibes through the community while we're waiting for it to come. I think that there is negativity in the Guild Wars 2 community right now that doesn't really need to be there, and I think at the moment that's because people see stuff that they don't like with the game, or you know, that whether it's too much grind for legendary weapons, that there's not enough grind for stuff after you've got a legendary weapon, or all manner of other conflicting things because it's such a large player base and everyone has different opinions. People see things that they don't like with Guild Wars 2 right now, and because there's no concept of an expansion being worked on, they kind of feel like they're left in the dark, and there's no small bit of their brain that can say, well, there's going to be an expansion and that could change stuff up drastically, because expansions feature load, right? And that's something that we're not going to get with the Living Story. If you go with an expansion, you could say, right, boom, here we go, we've got a whole new continent, we're going to go back to Cantha, we're going to go back to Elona, we've got a whole new personal story quest for you, tons more dynamic events, and even some changes up in regular Tyria. But in addition to that, they would do other stuff. They'd say, right, okay, no, also we're adding a looking for group tool. We know that a lot of you guys have been asking for that. That's coming with this expansion. We're adding a new type of mission. That's coming with this expansion. We're adding player housing. That's what you want. We're adding this. We're going to be adding a new tier of legendary weapons that gives people something to go for if they've already had a legendary weapon, and these are actually slightly less grind to get, so maybe people might want to go for that who haven't been interested in the first tier of legendary weapons. You know, they can feature load, they can do this stuff. They can say, right, it's an underwater expansion, but don't worry, we're massively revamping the underwater combat. And it doesn't actually matter whether they feature load as much stuff as I just gave as examples. The important part is that while we're waiting for that expansion to come out, there's a lot of excitement from the community because there's the potential for that to happen. And suddenly when we're talking about large-scale projects as expansions, people are more likely to expect and more likely to be excited about big revamps and changes to the game that they love, but it's just this one thing that they're really irritated about. Telling people instead that, oh yeah, we're going to be adding a little bit more content every 2 weeks that you can come and experience if you want, is drastically different. Now, to ArenaNet's credit, they have said that basically large changes like this, like the looking for group tool, which we do know that they've been working on, these things can be dropped in through these bi-weekly updates as well. Just because there's going to be living story progress going on, it doesn't mean that other people in the company are working on things that can add these big features. It's just that they're not going to be feature loaded, and we have no assurance of really when they're going to be coming. And I do think that ArenaNet are working on a lot of big stuff at the same time. You see, there's what, 250 people working at ArenaNet? There's a lot of guys. That's the same amount of people that made the game in the first place. And the Living Story consists of like 4 small teams of people. There's like hundreds of unaccounted employees who aren't working on the Living Story stuff. And those guys are working on bigger projects and stuff that seem like they're just going to be slotted into these bi-weekly Living Story updates. One particularly interesting thing, this was some pretty cool news that some people might have missed actually. There was a concept art competition that went on recently, and one of the ArenaNet artists won it, who has been stated to be working on Guild Wars 2, but he won it for a concept piece that was like this crazy looking futuristic insane city thing, and it looked so bizarre and so weird. A lot of people thought that that was a totally different ArenaNet game until people people were like, oh no, look, he is working on Guild Wars 2. So, you know, these people are concepting out very interesting, very weird cityscapes that could potentially be Cantha and drastic changes from the current Guild Wars 2 formula. We're seeing that, and that concept art is a great example of it. I should put it on the video somewhere so you guys can see it. It's a really interesting piece. It's very exciting to think that Cantha, you know, given the story and how xenophobic they've become, that they just become this massive futuristic metropolis. That would be really kind of interesting to see. So there are going to be these large changes coming to Guild Wars 2. It's just a question of we have no idea when, we have no assurance of how frequently, and we have no assurance of the quality that might come with them. This is my other big problem with the Living Story, aside from the whole feature loading stuff, and as well, I should mention the fact that they can't really market the Living Story stuff. They can't put a massive marketing budget behind some small 2-week update that's coming out. They can't really feasibly do that in the same way that you can properly market an expansion and not only bring tons of original players back, but also introduce a whole load of new consumers to the game. You can't really do that with a Living Story update. But my big problem with it is its episodic nature in the way that it's kind of mimicking TV. And in terms of the narrative of the story and its breadth, that really, really worries me. Because right now, what we've got is, in particular, this is because they're tying it to this whole temporary model. The idea of the Living Story is you have to be there as it's happening. If you don't tune in for this bi-weekly update, you're going to miss it. It's going to be gone. It's the living world. It's meant to be this idea that it's always going on at the same time as you. And that means that it's temporary content. And ArenaNet are being unflinching on this. It has to be temporary. And that's had some pretty profound implications on the way the Living Story's come out so far. See, because it's temporary, this means they can't make episode 8 or bi-weekly content 8 rely on understanding what happened in episode 3. And because of this, they can't really do very interesting stories. Instead, we've kind of got a bit of a cartoon thing going on, where at the end of every month, everything sort of has to return to the status quo, and we'll maybe have a little bit of a reference to something that happened last month, but really, it's returned back to normal, and anyone else can jump in and understand perfectly what's happened. It's sort of like a cartoon where every week we've got some other big bad guy that's threatening the world. And because of that, so far in the Living Story, I haven't, and this is coming from someone who's deeply invested in the lore, I have been completely uninterested in every story they've come out with for the Living Story so far. And I purely think it's because they can't do long, interesting narrative arcs, or they've shown no interest in doing it so far. They could, in theory, do it. They could keep everything temporary and do these interesting arcs that keep the return stayers really invested and actually make me feel for these characters. I don't care about Inspector Ellen Keel or anyone that I've met so far. I rarely understand the full story behind a lot of the bosses because the actual features in the game don't support the Living Story very well. I'll get to that in a second. But because of the way that they're doing this episodic, I find myself, even with the Bazaar of the Four Winds, with this beautiful map that's coming out, and, you know, these potential ties to Cantha, or maybe even the Tengu and so forth, as a lot of people thought, I'm not interested in it, because I don't see any large ramifications coming from the plot there. Just the general characters popping up again, and that's about it. There's no heavy investment here. And I'm already feeling this way, and now ArenaNet are talking about, oh look, we can use the Living Story to expand the map all the way down to Elona, or all the way down to Cantha, and it's like we're having an expansion that's just slowly rolled out. And yes, when we finally get to Cantha, we might only get a small section of the city at first, and it'll be gated until we make more content. But I'm fine with that. I don't really mind that. That's kind of how it was in Guild Wars 1 anyway, where you had to complete the main story before you would get through the gates, and they can easily invent some kind of similar reasoning here. And that would be fine, but I'm worried that when we finally get to Cantha, it's just going to be, oh, we have excuse plot to get to the first bit of the city. Okay, now we've got a completely separate excuse plot to get to the Echo Vowed and now the Jade Forest. How can they possibly do a really interesting and fascinating storyline? You know, for all the shit I give the personal story, at least it was one almost, actually. Well, no, even the personal story suffered from this. You know, it needs to be a cohesive story. At least after you meet Trahearne, as much as people shit on him. Once you meet Trahearne, it is a cohesive story from that point onwards, right? It's about attacking Orr and Zhaitan. It's not about the origins of your characters so much. Can they really do that on the Living Story in more than just a vague way that allows people to jump back in even if they've missed the rest of the series. I was a big fan of Lost when it was on TV, but Lost is a perfect example of a show on TV that does this kind of format where they try and have a really long, complicated story, people get bored, people move on, and then they lose the plot after they miss one episode. It's really hard to do a complicated narrative that actually keeps people invested when they can't go back and play the old stuff. So these are my kind of ideas for what they need to do to make the living story work. If this is really going to be the main driving force and we're not going to get any excitement on marketing or, feature loading, all these cool things that come from the expansion model, if ArenaNet are putting all their eggs in this one basket, I'm really uneasy about it unless they do a couple of things. First of all, they have to say no to the living story being temporary. We're getting awesome dungeons added to the game, we're getting whole zones added to the game, we're getting mini games, we're getting all kinds of stuff that's just being taken away from us. It feels like such a shame to see that. It's all just being lost and people aren't going to be coming back because ArenaNet are sort of aggressively saying, no, you have to come back now. I really don't think allowing people to replay that old stuff necessarily takes away from the feel of it being a living world. If I'm there when it's originally happening and the update first goes out, it still feels like a living world, regardless of whether some guy I've never met a couple of months down the line is going to be able to repeat the content. It still feels like the living world, and just because of the nature of MMOs, where communities flock around the new content, it's going to feel new and special and different that first time, and you're never going to have that massive, all these huge zergs and people experiencing all the content like we saw on South Sun where they added all this new stuff. You're never going to see that again, so there's still going to be that special spark there. I don't think this stuff has to be temporary, and it's a real shame that they are taking it out, because I really like the idea of a new player coming into Guild Wars 2, finishing their personal story, saying, hey, what's next? And then I can turn around and say, oh, well, look, since then, they've added all this stuff. Look, now you can go and have fun on the Flame and Frost stuff. It's kind of like a new personal story for you, and you've got all this stuff that you can slowly work your way through. But we can't say that, and that's one big problem with them making it temporary, but more importantly, if they stop it being temporary, people can catch up with the story at their own pace, and ArenaNet can do something actually interesting with the story. They can actually spend the time to get me invested in some of these characters, and hopefully as well, this is slightly a different topic, but hopefully they'll actually cover interesting lore too, instead of just adding new stuff, right? And hopefully they'll honour it in interesting ways. They got a couple of narrative designers who I think have done quite well, but here's the other big thing, okay? So that's one big thing I think they need to change for the living story strategy for me to be particularly excited. And the second thing is, they need, for the love of God, to overhaul the systems in the game that are delivering this stuff to us. Heralds are barely useful, and relying on the mail system to give us like loads of the story and pointers and directions to where to go, and flimsy characters just sat about here and there that we speak to for a little bit of backstory, is way too hard to follow the story. Way too hard. How many people genuinely understood everything that was happening with Kanak on the South Sun update? Who understood it, or who just walked from here to here to here, followed maybe Delphi guides just to quickly speak to all of the NPCs, and then just ran a dungeon instance? People don't care because you make it so hard for them to care, because there are no real systems in the game to deliver us the living story. We all know having a quest log and some permanent I completed this at one point bit of the UI would do massive wonders for the living story, but ArenaNet are refusing to do it because they don't want anything like a quest log in their game, because this is about dynamic events and stuff. Then they need to find another way. My suggestion would be, they already added a very cool piece of the UI, a very cool idea when they were originally developing the game for the personal story. You've got a massive log on your hero panel showing all of the decisions you made and all of the quests that you did as you went through the personal story. Why can't we have that for the living story? Just add another tab there. It's the living story one, and every time you complete, so whether it's temporary or not, every time you complete one of these, it adds another little section to that UI with an overview of what you've done, and you use that as the quest panel. That can be the just like it's used in the personal story. People don't realize this, but while you're in the middle of a personal story quest, you can open up that tab and it will give you your objectives, and it will cross them off as you go, just like a real quest panel does. There's even some really weird stuff where it holds exclusive quest items for you that aren't really quest items in this game, but if you have a look on some early human characters, you'll see that, like, it's got, oh, I collected this item and here it is on the UI. It doesn't exist in my inventory, but it does exist here. You know, they have these interesting ideas there. That would be perfect for the living story strategy. If they reconfigured that slightly, adopted that for the new content that's coming out, and then we have a permanent idea, a real sense of completion for for this temporary content and real demarcation of where we should go, how the story's been progressing in a really strong, well-written out, clear, concise way, that's going to help a lot. Instead of relying on these weird mails that we have to click show me on, that are going to delete themselves or disappear, or not even appear for you because you've got too many mails because the limit is so slow. You know, it's clunky, it doesn't work very well. They need to first do something like that, and second, really have another hard look at the way they're giving us the story, because people miss tons of it and it's not compelling right now. Those are the changes I'd make. If they did that, I would be feeling a lot more excited about their living story strategy. Right now, I feel really on edge about it, because I don't think things like that are going to happen, and I think we're just going to keep getting these sort of disconnected, here's a bunch more achievements and maybe a new zone every now and then thrown into the game, and we're going to have a real just checklist culture, and I'm not going to be grabbed by the story in any way even vaguely close to how I was grabbed by the story in the original game. Guild Wars 2 already didn't really grab me in the same way the original game did, just because it was so disjointed and there were so many paths, and now they're just throwing another disjointed way of giving us the plot again. And for players like me, that was the thing that really excited me about the game. Yes, I've become invested in, you know, gearing my character up and getting ascended stuff, and maybe even eventually one day getting a legendary when I can justify the cost of a precursor and all these other PvE things. But really, that's what fueled my excitement for the game, and I'm very cynical about the living story going forward. I can see the benefits. It's like I say, this could be amazing. Free updates for us that could easily become more than what an expansion would offer us. There's no assurance for it, as I said, but this could be more than what an expansion gives us. That's very exciting. For free, if you don't want to spend anything in the gem store, you don't have to. The game's really pretty lenient with that, and you would get all of this extra stuff for free. It's an amazing game to play for a gamer on a budget, and it could really be very good for that. But these other things are far more important to me, and I'm not seeing that they're happening. So that's kind of my opinion on the living story. You know, there's other stuff like the rewards being tied to the content. I feel like if they're gonna let us replay stuff, by the way, have the rewards be exclusive to the living story, and then once that's gone, that month's over, they take the rewards away but leave the content there so that people can replay it, but people who get the rewards for the first time still feel special. They could do that too. But yeah, anyway, that's kind of my opinions on the living story. That's also some news to some of you guys, what they're doing with Guild Wars 2. This ended up kind of negative, but I do really kind of want to express how awesome this could be. If you've been sort of out of Guild Wars 2 for a little while, they are adding a huge new map outside of Mount Maelstrom, like today, which should be very fun and very interesting to play. So do check it out. I think that the quality of the content in terms of like the dungeons they're putting out, ArenaNet are much better at making content now. The most recent dungeon they did, although it really sucks it's being taken away, was very cool. They did some really interesting achievements, like actual challenges within the dungeon you've got to do to get these achievements. Very, very clever, very well designed. It's just this other stuff's kind of bogging it down for me personally. But I want to hear what you guys think. Are you excited about the bi-weekly stuff, or are you kind of pessimistic about it? You'd rather a large expansion? It's a discussion on the tips of a lot of people's tongues. The idea of temporary versus permanent sort of is a separate argument, but I think it's a major factor in this for me, so I've brought it in here. But yeah, there you go, guys. Thanks very much for watching. Would love to hear what you have to say. It's nice to do another discussion piece, I guess, and I'll see you next time. If you're wondering also why Guild Wars 2 Mysteries has been away for a while, it's because the latest Guild Wars 2 book was announced. I bought it, but it's not arrived yet. I want to read it first before I do the mysteries, because I've had like 3 separate people tell me I should hold off until I do the next mystery until I've read it. I don't want to do a mystery and then everyone's like, oh, what are you talking about? They did the book. So I'm going to wait until I read that, and we'll see how it goes from there. But yeah, thanks very much for watching, guys, and I will see you next time. Have a wonderful day.